Welcome to episode 60, our diamond anniversary of the G2 on 5G. It's the latest inside scoop on everything 5G. We cover 6 topics in about 15 minutes, and it's brought to you by More Insights and Strategy. I'm Will Townsend, and joining me again this week is fellow analyst Anshel and Will. Let's get started. My first topic this week, news broke around Spain's recent low-band spectrum auction. And many called it a failure because it only raised a little over €1 billion. And man, it got me thinking. I shared my insights on Twitter and actually had, a lot of people comment and agree with me. But I think it's high time that, the government, isn't filling its coffers and actually making spectrum affordable for operators, especially in a country like Spain, to get 5G deployed. We've talked about, where Europe has lagged somewhat, the United States and Korea in particular. And so, I wouldn't call this, a failure or necessarily a success, but I think, this is a win for operators in general. So what are your thoughts?
I think it really does look, compared to like other spectrum auctions, it doesn't really look as good on the number side. If that's what you care about. I think
Right.
the way you perceive these auctions is ultimately how you determine success, right? I am much more of the camp that government's role is to facilitate growth and to encourage investment, and to make sure the taxpayers are not getting ripped off, but to use taxpayer funds efficiently and effectively. And to me, charging $45 billion for spectrum just doesn't sound like a win for anyone.
No.
And I think that if this spectrum is worth, the 1.3 or 1.2 or 1.1, I've seen multiple numbers thrown out from different outlets. You know, I don't think it's a bad thing if it's going to pay for, one, what it costs to make that spectrum available, and two, to continue to fund whatever agencies regulate the wireless industry. So I think if it's a fair amount, I think it's a huge success. Because I think like we're in the same boat on this. Overspending on spectrum doesn't really help anybody.
No, and
It eventually gets passed on, right?
yeah, and potentially it can delay the deployment, of a new network. So yeah, interesting. You and I seem to be on the same sheet, but it'll be interesting to see, what happens, and not only in Spain but other countries in Europe. And certainly, this auction came in, I think, at, just right at kind of the minimum, starting price. And so that's going to allow, operators to invest in, CapEx and OpEx to get these networks deployed. But we'll keep our eyes and, ears peeled and report back on future podcasts. But let's move to your first topic this week. You want to talk about Apple and a new 5G enabled iPhone.
Yeah, so there have been lots of rumors swirling around the next generation of iPhones, which makes sense because we're in July and we'll probably get new iPhones in September or October. And those will probably be, the iPhone 13, and those will very likely be all of an entire 5G phone lineup. But what's interesting is we're seeing rumors that they will introduce an iPhone SE potentially next year. But there might be other versions of the iPhone that replace the current iPhone mini, which I currently have. And I actually like the mini, even though I do think it's a little too small. I think a lot of people have seen that the iPhone mini hasn't been a very successful device. And I think there's a multitude of reasons for that. I think the big one being that people who like, having a small iPhone are not necessarily yearly upgrade people, and they're more price conscious and are not as excited to jump onto the latest and greatest, including something like 5G. So I have a feeling that the 5G mini, which is technically going to be, or 5G SE is what's being rumored, will likely be third generation of the iPhone SE, and it will come with 5G. What I'm curious about is whether or not they'll put millimeter wave on it. But I think that they will, simply because one, Verizon, and two, I think that they've got so much volume with the current lineup of millimeter wave modules on all of the iPhone 12s that I think they've driven the price down enough where it doesn't become enough of a factor to make the iPhone SE an unaffordable or too expensive of a device to offer at a competitive price rate.
Yeah. Yeah, you're the device expert. You keep up with the numbers, but yeah, anecdotally, I understand that, the mini, the form factor, Apple expected it to be a lot more successful than it's become, and I think you make an excellent point. People that tend to have these smaller format phones are the ones that tend to, wait for those feature upgrades, and that's a nice segue to my second point. I want to talk about AT&T and Verizon. They announced earnings this week, and we'll talk a little bit about T-Mobile. They'll be following, and I think at the end of next week. But one of the interesting things that I noted about the AT&T earnings announcement for second quarter was that they roughly added 1 million pre and postpaid phone ads. And this is a clear indication that people are upgrading their phones, and they're upgrading obviously to 5G capable phones. And I'll also note that AT&T reported its lowest churn. It was under, it was well under 1%, and they had some great gains in, sort of their fiber business as they roll that out. And Verizon reported pretty decent earnings, not quite the growth that AT&T reported. But Verizon also, they also reported really solid phone ads, both for pre and postpaid as well. So, so clearly, people are getting on the 5G bandwagon. This sort of comes, sort of on the heels of AT&T announcing, I believe last week, that they're covering 250 million plus subscribers with their 5G service. I found that number interesting. I didn't think it was that they were that penetrated with 5G deployment, but it's interesting. And I think I expect that T-Mobile, when they announce earnings next week, that they should be posting some pretty aggressive consumer ads just based on their leadership position currently today with 5G deployment. And I'm also expecting to see some really positive momentum as they, build out their T-Mobile for Business service offering. And we've talked about those in the past as well. But I wanted to kick it over to you. And any additional insights on the earnings?
Yeah. So one, Verizon killed their big 5G upgrade phone promo, which is what I think drove a lot of these net ads.
Yeah.
Two, I think if you look at AT&T's coverage, I think a big component of their 5G coverage in terms of POPs was a DSS implementation. So they have a lot of they don't have a lot. They have dedicated bandwidth for 5G, but they're also using DSS. So I think that's how they got 250. I think if you look at T-Mobile, I don't think they used any DSS to get where they are at. And I know Verizon's using DSS for like probably 95% of their coverage today. So they're not, it's like the coverage numbers are not going to be really what matters anymore because everyone's going to be using DSS to pad that. And we knew it was going to happen. I think the big factor is going to be mid-band. And when that comes around, I think we talked about this last week, bandwidth numbers are going to keep going up. And whoever has the best mid-band coverage is going to be the one who maintains, the highest average speeds. And I think highest average speeds will probably be what will be the determiner of who has the best 5G network going forward. In addition to that, all I have to say is it's amazing what you can do when you focus on your core business. AT&T and Verizon both refocusing on their core networks. Suddenly they're getting net ads and they're spending more time and effort on growing that part of their business, which is their core. And I think AT&T and Verizon both kind of refocusing on those has shown dividends. Also, both companies have a lot of investment that they've spent on spectrum, and they've got to continue to grow, whether it's through phones or IoT devices or home broadband connections. They've got to keep growing their user base to sustain the growth that they need to pay for these spectrum investments.
I agree. And, we talked about AT&T last week. I attended their 5G event in Chelsea and New York. And clearly, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about AT&T at my third topic, but clearly in divesting, themselves from Warner, to your point, focusing on what their core competency really is network build out. I agree with you. It's definitely paying dividends for AT&T and certainly for Verizon. But speaking of 5G speeds, OpenSignal recently published a report with respect to the European market, and you wanted to share some insights there.
Yeah. So Ian Fogg, who works for OpenSignal, is their kind of in-house analyst. He gets access to all their awesome data, and he's a good friend of mine. And what's interesting is they published a European smartphone speed race, which I actually think is much more interesting than the US, because there's a lot more phones in Europe than there are in the US, especially when you add Oppo, Xiaomi, and Huawei. So what they found and what Ian wrote about was, one, that Apple's devices saw the greatest jump in overall download speeds compared with 4G devices, which makes sense because of the iPhone 12. Going from a 4G device to a 5G device makes a huge difference. They also found that Samsung's 5G devices lagged on download speed compared to other smartphone brands in Europe, which is very interesting. In UK, Italy, and Germany were the three primary markets that they compared against. And in the UK, Apple was number one. In Italy, OnePlus was number one. And in Germany, OnePlus was number one, while Samsung was last in UK and in Italy. So there's definitely some room for improvement for Samsung and their download speeds in Europe. What was also really interesting was they did a survey of all devices in the UK, and they found that the top device for download speeds was actually a Samsung phone. It was actually the Samsung Galaxy Fold 5G, which means that most likely the reason why Samsung's download speeds might not be the greatest is because they also have very broad portfolio of 5G devices, which include, $200 devices, $400 devices, and $1,200 devices, while maybe some of the other brands like OnePlus have fewer devices and maybe more heavily loaded onto the front end with the more expensive ones. In Italy, Oppo had the fastest 5G device, which was quickly followed by a Samsung device. And in Germany, the fastest was a OnePlus device. So the interesting thing is, in Europe, the Samsung phones are actually Exynos based. They're not Snapdragon based, but the OnePlus phones and the Oppos are. So it's definitely a bit of a battle for the top device when it comes to modems from Samsung and Qualcomm. And I don't see much of Apple at all in the top 10 fastest devices. I think only in the UK do you see Apple even hitting the top 10 of fastest devices with its individual devices, not an aggregate. And then the last interesting thing was that Apple and Qualcomm chipsets are more competitive on speed in 5G devices than in 4G devices, which makes sense because Apple is using a Qualcomm modem in their 5G to phones. So I would expect that the gap would narrow considerably there. But overall, it's a very interesting report. It's pretty lengthy, lots of graphs, very visual. We'll post it on our Twitter and we'll add it to the description of the video. But it's just an interesting report, just because it kind of takes into account lots of different 5G brands rather than the US, which is a very binary market right now with Samsung and Apple mostly competing with a bit of OnePlus. But it's just an interesting kind of peer into what's going on with 5G devices.
Well, you're definitely our device expert, and I am surprised to hear, how they reviewed Samsung. But I think your insight is dead on. I think because Samsung has such a range, and we've talked about how Qualcomm is supporting, a range of, price points from low, mid to very, very high end. And so that seems like a logical conclusion to come to, that maybe they got dinged just because they have a very, kind of broad set of offerings there. But with that, let's move to my third and final topic this week, and I want to talk about AT&T and Dish. And the two companies struck a $5 billion 10-year agreement for AT&T to support Dish's MVNO business. And so the brands there, cover, I'm kind of looking at my notes here, Boost, obviously, Ting, and Republic Wireless. And I found this interesting because, obviously, exiting the merger with Sprint, T-Mobile made a lot of concessions to help Dish get, spun up, including supporting their MVNO offerings. But, what Dish cites is, some of the rationale going back to the fact that, AT&T made that announcement covering 250 million subscribers. There's access to AT&T's roaming and transport services, which will very, quickly allow them to ramp up new 5G services as they build out their network. And what I also felt was pretty compelling is that as part of the terms of the deal, AT&T will be able to access some of Dish's spectrum for its own subscribers in select markets. So whatever that means, they'll be carving things out there. But this is huge, and they're estimating that the first couple of years, the payments from Dish to AT&T could be $500 million plus, and then that drops obviously over time to get to that 10-year horizon. But here's another opportunity for, it's a big win, I think, for AT&T, and it's going to bring a lot of positive cash flow to allow them to continue to build out their network. And certainly one of their big objectives is to build out all that C-band spectrum that they recently acquired. So what are your thoughts here?
It's interesting. I've seen different takes on this deal, both positive and negative.
Yeah.
I didn't really have much of an opinion until maybe 10 seconds ago. I would say that I think it's a good deal for both companies, and I can see why it makes sense, because Dish is not going to build out their network fast enough. We know that.
Right. Yeah.
They're going to need some support, and that support's going to come from AT&T. And we know that AT&T is going to need as many subscribers as they can get as quickly as possible to justify its build out, and that will partly come from Dish. So I do think this is a good partnership for both companies. I do think AT&T will want to have access to some of Dish's spectrum assets in certain places. I think AT&T understands how important spectrum is. I don't think they've ever been foolish about that. And I think the big question is, what happened to the T-Mobile relationship, right?
Yeah.
Because it seems like ever since the deal went down, the relationship between Dish and T-Mobile has only gone downhill. And I think this is a culmination of that, right? Because T-Mobile does have a very robust 5G network that they are ahead of AT&T and Verizon on. And the fact that they went and made a $5 billion deal with AT&T, to me, signals that the relationship between T-Mobile and Dish has not gotten better. In fact, it's probably only gotten worse. And I'm not really sure what happened. But ultimately, we all need Dish to be a competitive operator, and we need we need them to become a solid fourth place player if we want the market to continue to grow. And we'll see what happens, but Dish has not really lived up to their expectations in the last years that I can remember. So I'm really hoping that they're able to get this 5G network off the ground and really get people excited about what they're doing.
Yeah, it is interesting. It kind of caught me by surprise. I think it's more of a win for AT&T with the cash flow coming in and access to some of Dish's spectrum assets. It also makes me, believe like maybe one of the other factors here was if you look at what AT&T has done, and clearly in the United States, among its competitors, I believe AT&T has done the best job virtualizing its network. They've been a leader. They've been at it for many years. The announcement with Azure sort of passing that torch to them with 5 to 6 years of invested IP in that. I think that aligns very well to Dish's plan to do a very highly virtualized software-defined network with
Mhm.
core and RAM. Um, and so I think it's architecturally, it's a great fit for them, to partner with AT&T to build out their MVNO business. But time will tell. Yeah, it's quite interesting. But let's move to your third and final topic this week. And it's no surprise we're hearing in the news all the time about semiconductor shortages with respect to automobiles and what's going on there. And you wanted to share some information, some insight that Intel and TSMC provided with respect to how long they believe the semiconductor shortage to last.
Yeah, so these companies' CEOs have both come out and said that during their earnings or during their earnings calls, have said that they expect this chip shortage to continue into 2023,
Wow.
which actually doesn't surprise me at all. Um, I think the best case scenario was next year.
Yeah.
But 2023 makes sense to me for a multitude of reasons. And I think we might actually I actually think this chip shortage can be alleviated sooner if demand comes down. But the problem is that we have so many automotive manufacturers, specifically on the automotive side,
That are
moving
backed up.
towards
Yeah.
EV. Well, it's not just backed up. So I think the pivot from internal combustion to EV is driving so much more demand for electronics components
Hmm.
that we are seeing a shortage on that side. But we're also seeing shortages in other areas as well, right? And if you look at what it takes to build a semiconductor foundry, also known as a fab,
Yeah.
um, some of these tools take 18 months. So if we knew the chip shortage was happening back in October of last year, which is when it started really, ringing the bells in people's heads,
Yeah.
then you wouldn't expect to see kind of any relaxing of that until mid next year, which sounds like when we'll probably start to see some relief, um, at least on a global scale. So
Yeah.
I think 2023 is a conservative estimate. Um, I think it assumes that the chip shortage will only be alleviated by building physical capacity.
Right.
But at the same time, there's also a lot of investment happening within the U.S. itself
Mhm.
to expand capacity
For sure.
to ensure security of chip supply at home.
Hmm.
So there's a multitude of efforts going on. I mean, in South Korea, there's tens of billions of dollars being invested. And
Yep.
TSMC said they upped their expected investment to 27 billion,
And
which
part
is
of that's in Phoenix, right? Phoenix, Arizona.
yeah. So
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of that's actually going to happen in Arizona. TSMC's fab in Arizona was originally going to be one fab, and I think that
Hmm.
they're now building like six. So between Intel and TSMC, Arizona is going to be a very busy place uh,
Yeah.
in the next year or two.
Yeah.
But overall, I think we might see capacity loosen up by 2023. Um, but I think 2023 is a conservative estimate, and it's based on the availability of tools
Mm.
and substrates and other parts of the semiconductor fabrication chain that are necessary to the process happening because it's a very complicated, resource intensive application that needs very skilled workers as well. So you can't
Yeah.
just pull people out of thin air that know how to run a fab.
Yeah. No, the bar is quite high. I'll also add too, in my hometown of Austin, Texas, Samsung has a semiconductor fab, and there's a second that appears to be landing either in Austin or in Taylor, Texas, I believe, which is right outside of Austin as well. And I believe The estimated investment in that is 17 or 18 billion dollars. So we'll get there, to your point, but to your other point, it takes time to get these tools in place, to get the processes in place, to have the necessary people trained. It's a very high bar. And we also, I think, talked on a prior podcast how Huawei is shifting its high silicon design capability and investing in a fab, but that's going to take them quite a while as well. So, I mean, we're seeing all the right things, in motion, but it just takes time. And I agree with you, 2023 is probably pretty conservative. They could even potentially be a little bit further out there. But hey, another great podcast this week, Anshel. Why don't you take us home?
Absolutely. We hope our viewers and listeners found this week's topics interesting. If anyone out there would like to provide us insight for a future podcast on any 5G topic, please reach out to us on social media. Will is at Welltown Tech, and I'm at Anshel Sag. We hope you have a great weekend, and please tune again next week.